The office was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of keyboards creating a sterile symphony that masked the tension in the air. Emily sat at her desk, eyes glued to her computer screen, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't focus on the quarterly reports. All she could think about was the secret she had been keeping for months. Her heart raced as she glanced at the clock, counting down the minutes until she could escape the suffocating confines of her cubicle. Down the hall, in his corner office, Mark leaned back in his leather chair, feet propped up on the desk. His tie hung loose around his neck, a sign of his relaxed demeanor, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed his true nature. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, drumming his fingers impatiently on the polished surface as he waited for an answer. "Hey, it's me," Mark said when Emily finally picked up. "Are you ready?" Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "Yes, I just need to wrap things up here." "Good. See you soon," Mark replied, hanging up before she could respond. Her hands trembled as she shut down her computer, gathering her things quickly. She couldn't afford to be caught, not now. Not when everything was falling apart. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like an eternity, each floor passing in agonizing slowness. Finally, the doors opened, and she hurried to her car, slipping inside without looking back. As she drove home, the weight of her decisions bore down on her. She loved her husband, Jonathan, more than anything. But love wasn't enough to stave off the fear that had gnawed at her since she discovered her pregnancy. A pregnancy that shouldn't have been possible, at least not with Jonathan's child. The house was empty when she arrived, the silence almost deafening. Jonathan had left for a late business meeting, giving her the perfect opportunity to meet Mark. She paced the living room, anxiety twisting her insides into knots. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to mock her, each second a reminder of the life she was betraying. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. It was a text from Mark, "I'm here." She hesitated, staring at the message as if it were a lifeline. But it was no lifeline, it was a noose tightening around her neck. Taking a deep breath, she slipped out the front door, careful to lock it behind her. The cool evening air hit her like a slap, bringing her back to reality. Mark's car was parked a few houses down, the tinted windows hiding him from view. As she approached, the passenger door swung open, and she slid inside wordlessly. Mark didn't waste any time, pulling away from the curb and merging into the flow of traffic. "You look nervous," he said, glancing at her with a sly smile. "I am," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, everything will be fine," Mark assured her, though his tone lacked sincerity. They drove in silence for a while, the cityscape blurring past them. Emily's thoughts were a whirlwind, each one more terrifying than the last. She knew what she had to do, but the consequences were too heavy to bear. Her marriage, her family, everything she had built with Jonathan, all of it was at stake. Finally, they arrived at a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. Mark parked in the back lot, away from prying eyes. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Come on," he said, leading her toward the entrance. Inside, the clinic was cold and clinical, the walls painted a sterile white. The receptionist barely looked up as they walked past, heading straight for the examination room. Mark pushed the door open, and Emily stepped inside. her legs feeling like jelly. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, stood by the table. She nodded curtly at Mark and then turned her attention to Emily. "Are you ready?" she asked without preamble. Emily nodded, though her heart screamed otherwise. She lay back on the table, the paper rustling beneath her. The doctor began preparing the equipment, her movements precise and efficient. "This won't take long," the doctor assured her, though Emily doubted she truly understood the gravity of the situation. As the procedure began, Emily closed her eyes, trying to block out the reality of what was happening. She thought of Jonathan, of their life together, the love they shared, the dreams they had built. And then there was Mark, the man who had offered her something she never knew she needed, but at what cost? The test was quick, over almost as soon as it had begun. The doctor finished up and stepped back, leaving Emily to process her emotions alone. "It'll take a few days for the results," the doctor said, packing up her things. "We'll call you as soon as we have them." Emily nodded numbly, her mind racing with possibilities. What would she do if the test confirmed her worst fears? Could she stand by and watch her marriage crumble, or would she fight for the life she had always known? Mark led her back to the car, his grip firm on her arm. They drove in silence again, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. When they reached her house, he helped her out of the car and walked her to the door. "Remember, whatever happens, I'm here for you," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. She nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As he drove away, she watched the taillights disappear into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the house, she found Jonathan waiting for her, his expression unreadable. He stood in the doorway to the living room, hands clasped behind his back. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of tension. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. How much did he know? How much had he suspected? "Just out," she replied lamely, avoiding his gaze. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Out? At this hour?" Emily swallowed hard, her throat constricting. "I needed some air." He studied her for a moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Is there something you need to tell me?"